What does Christian art get wrong? To begin at the beginning, take a look at the following painting of Adam and Eve by the German Renaissance master Lucas Cranach the Elder. A familiar scene, but perhaps not an accurate one. The first question that might arise is this: why do the first humans have belly buttons? Adam was created from dust, and Eve from Adam's rib, so it is strange to see them depicted with this vestige of an umbilical cord. It is possible, I suppose, that God simply created them this way. In any case, it's hardly the most egregious of theological oversights, but certainly worth a mention. A second problem, then. Why doesn't the serpent have feet? In the Genesis creation account, Eve is convinced by a crafty serpent to eat from the forbidden tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She then hands the fruit to Adam, who does the same. It's this moment which is captured by Cranach in the painting. After this original sin, God punishes all parties involved, including the serpent, whom he reprimands as follows: "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and will eat dust all the days of your life." The clear implication is that before the fall, this serpent was not crawling on his belly. A natural reading is therefore that this creature had originally possessed feet, or perhaps wings, which were removed by God at the fall. Some suggest that instead of having extra limbs, the serpent had previously simply had the ability to stand erect on its tail, which it lost as punishment for its sin. Thus, John Calvin, in his biblical commentary, "There will, however, be no absurdity in supposing that the serpent was again consigned to that former condition to which he was already naturally subject. For thus thee, who had exalted himself against the image of God, was thrust back into his proper rank." Yet, especially since it appears that some snakes can still stand up to some degree, I'm inclined to read the text as suggesting that the serpent once had feet. In doing so, by the way, I find myself in agreement with, amongst others, Flavius Josephus and Martin Luther. 2. Doubting Thomas. John's Gospel uniquely tells us that the Apostle Thomas, hearing of Jesus' resurrection, was suspicious of the reports. He says, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and move my hand into his side, I will not believe." Jesus later appears to Thomas and tells him to touch his wounds and stop doubting. Here's Caravaggio's rendition. This seems inoffensive enough. So why does it make our list? Well, let's revisit the text of John's Gospel. Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Notice, viewer, Thomas never touches Jesus' wounds. At least, we're not told that he does. It may seem implied in the text, but all we know for sure is that Thomas desires to touch Jesus, and that Jesus later offers to let him, at which point Thomas confesses that he's God incarnate. There is a reading of this tale which has Thomas's eagerness for empirical evidence dissolve in the event of meeting the person of Christ, as if Jesus says, "Well, go on then, if that's what you really want," and Thomas immediately realizes the folly of his request. On this exegesis, this episode becomes an important theological indicator that Christianity is not about scientific proof of religious claims, but rather it's about a relationship with Jesus. Notice also that Jesus says, "Because you have seen me, you have believed." In doing so, he doesn't mention having been touched or further probed in any way. Of course, we can't rule out that the author of John's Gospel intended to imply that Thomas physically touched Jesus in the end, but we have no direct indication that he actually did. We simply don't know. And especially when the debates surrounding the physicality of Jesus' resurrection are taken into account, this makes the decision to present the event in this way, as almost all paintings of the scene do, not just an artistic choice, but a theological one too. Did you know that Banksy recently unveiled a new interesting mural of a rhinoceros in London? Strangely enough, it might depend on what kind of news you read. As it turns out, of the outlets that are reporting on this story, the majority of them are left-leaning. How do I know this? All thanks to today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News aggregates thousands of news outlets from all over the world in one place, so you can compare reporting across the political spectrum. Every story has a quick breakdown of the political leaning of the sources reporting on the story, as well as a factuality rating for the sources, as well as information about who owns the sources. Take a look at the story that I just mentioned. In this case, I can see that 56% of the outlets reporting on this story are left-leaning, and only 19% are right-leaning. This means that if you only read right-leaning news, you may well never have encountered Banksy's OC's new rhinoceros. Of course, when it comes to things like politics, this can be extremely important. That's why Ground News has a dedicated blind spot tab, which specifically seeks out stories that you would otherwise miss based on what kind of news you usually read. So, see the stories you would otherwise miss and cut through media bias by going to ground.news/AlexOC. Subscribe using my link to get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan for as little as $5 a month. And with that said, let's continue. 3. The Horns of Moses. Take a look at Michelangelo's famous sculpture of Moses. What do you notice? Aside from the apparent pump from carrying those stone tablets, the most notable anatomical feature of the prophet is his head. Or rather, what's coming out of his head. Yes, it is a pair of horns. Why on earth does Moses have horns? Well, because Michelangelo's sculpture was informed by the following passage from Exodus, describing the moments after Moses had spoken with God. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. So, why the horns? It's all in the word radiant. Remember, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and so any English version we read will be subject to editorial translation. The word translated in this passage by the NIV as radiant is keren, which can have multiple meanings depending on the context. Literally, it means a horn or antler. Thus, in Psalm 69, we read, "This will please the Lord more than an ox, more than a bull with its horns and hooves." The word for horns here is that same keren, but it can also mean a ray or beam of light. So where the word is used in Exodus, it's variously translated. Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. Moses wist not that the skin of his face shone while he talked with him. He was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. In the 4th century, St. Jerome produced a Latin translation of the Bible, which is known as the Vulgate. It was later affirmed by the Catholic Church as the official Latin version. In it, when Jerome translates this passage from Exodus, he translates the word keren literally into the Latin word for horned. So the Catholic Church's approved Latin translation of the verse would read something like, "Moses did not know that his face was horned because he had been talking with God." Now, given that Moses is said shortly afterwards to have put a veil over his head while speaking with the Israelites because of the state of his face, not to mention the sheer strangeness of Moses developing horns as a result of speaking with God, I think it's fair to say that Jerome was incorrect in his interpretation of the Hebrew. So this strange motif of a horned Moses that crops up across Christian art is due to a mistranslation of the Bible. Honorable mention. Jesus' physical appearance. What did Jesus really look like? I recently spent an hour with Dr. John Nelson on my podcast discussing this question. He drew my attention to a 2018 study which found what they called an egocentric bias in the American public's imagination of what God looks like. That is, asked to choose which images most resemble God, attractive people pick attractive faces, black people pick black faces, old people pick old faces, and so on. Last year, I visited the Basilica of the Annunciation in Nazareth, Jesus' hometown. In the courtyard, there are 43 mosaics of Mary holding the newborn Christ, sent in from countries all across the world. The most noticeable feature of this gallery is this egocentric bias applied to the Marian devotions. Thus, alongside this Caucasian Christ from Italy, you'll also find a Thai Christ and a Chinese Christ. This helps to demonstrate how, in religious art, Jesus is often depicted in such a way that's more sensitive to the artist's desire to see themselves in the Christ than to the historical data surrounding Jesus' appearance. Putting ethnicity aside, we can consider some other factors. Jesus' physical characteristics are not described in any detail in the Gospels, and so there's no direct scriptural basis for determining features like his height, his build, his hair, his beard length, or his clothing. But we do have some clues. Consider, for example, how Jesus is often depicted in a long and flowing robe, such as in this painting by El Greco of Christ healing the blind. It's unlikely that this is how Jesus dressed during his earthly ministry. Take a look at Luke chapter 20, verse 46, where Jesus says, "Beware the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets." Biblical historian Joan Taylor, author of What Did Jesus Look Like?, writes, "It is an irony that the very clothing Jesus defines as self-aggrandizing and different to his own is the clothing that artists have dressed him in for some 1600 years. Jesus is more likely to have worn a tunic that fell just below the knees. There's also some dispute about Jesus' hair. given that despite artists commonly depicting it as long and flowing beneath the shoulders, Paul appears to suggest in 1 Corinthians that long hair on a man is something to be ashamed of. Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? This is something he's unlikely to have said if Jesus had been known for having long hair. We can never know exactly what the historical Jesus looked like, but he probably didn't look like this. This video has been an adapted version of an essay I published on Substack over a month ago. It's free to read, and if you want to read more of my work, you can do so at alexoconnor.com.